Good morning, Confirmation. I am Shannon, your Confirmation Director, and I am joined on stage with Rabbi Doug Alpert from Congregation Kol Ami. Let's give Rabbi Doug a warm welcome. We are so excited to have Rabbi Doug with us, and I invite you, in your confirmation journal, there is actually a blank place on page 30. If you want to take any notes or jot down any thoughts from our conversation today, this is a great place for you to do so. And then when you get a time to break into your small group, this is a good place to go over any thoughts that you may have heard from our discussion today. So, Rabbi Doug, we're just going to have a conversation here on stage and allow these students to listen in. Does that sound good?
It sounds great.
But first, I just want to know a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the congregation that you are a rabbi for.
I'm a lifelong Kansas City resident. Actually graduated Shawnee Mission South High School, went away undergrad, came back for law school, and over the course of my life had a couple of different professions, but ended up in 2006, I entered seminary for my rabbinical studies and was ordained in 2012. I actually got my pulpit, Congregation Kol Ami, which Kol Ami translates as all my people. In 2011, after a year of being in Prairie Village, we moved into the city. We do not own a building. We lease space, sometimes from All Souls at 45th and Warwick near the Kemper Museum. But we have a community garden east of Troost at 43rd and Forest. And when the weather's decent, we're out there for services and just to be and to grow food and to be in a neighborhood with people we otherwise would never meet. And oftentimes my congregants are over at our house for study, for prayer, and probably mostly to eat the rabbi's food.
What do you like to cook for them?
We'll do our share of Jewish dishes like kugel and different soups and rugelach and
Sounds delicious.
Yeah. But the synagogue we're not affiliated with any one Jewish denomination, and that's important to us. We wanted to be as open as possible. Moving back into the city has bucked a decades-long trend of movement further and further out this way. Most of the synagogues that you probably know about are out here in South Johnson County. We wanted to be in the city. It puts us in space with people not like us and kind of compels us to confront issues that occur in the central city, and we like that. We do a lot of work. I do a lot of work with the black community on the executive committee in Missouri, the NAACP. I work with the Poor People's Campaign, Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity, Stand Up KC, fast food, low-wage workers. So we are active in the community, and being in the city helps us to do that kind of work.
I live in KCMO, so I'm a fan of that. Well, and I think some of us have, kind of a very basic understanding of the Jewish faith. So maybe let's start, if you could just kind of give us, maybe in 5 minutes or less, kind of just the broad overview or highlights of Judaism, of the Jewish faith.
So 5 minutes is plenty of time since we just entered the year 5,780 on the Jewish calendar, so we can get all of that covered in 5 minutes.
Just the highlights.
So if I could give you maybe a basic idea of Judaism and how it's distinct, at least from Christianity, that Judaism is much more behavior-based than faith-based. So I read Apostles' Creed, and it's what you say is very much grounded in faith. Judaism really is much more about behavior. Judaism tells you how to act in every aspect of everyday life. There is nothing so small that it doesn't go unnoticed, and we haven't made a rule about it. But it doesn't necessarily tell you how to feel about it. Now, that said, is there a faith element in Judaism? Sure there is. God is mysterious, and we can't. We with our human intellect, we are really incapable of fully knowing God, and with that acknowledgement, there's got to be a little bit of a faith element to kind of buy in and to be on this journey that has God as a part of the journey. But it is much more an emphasis on behavior. That said, the other piece of that is our relationship with God. As we see, we're in covenant with God, and it's like a contract. So we stand at Mount Sinai. We all stand at Mount Sinai and receive the Torah, and that puts us in covenant with God. So part of that is to say, so you talk about an Old Testament and a New Testament. We don't refer to our Hebrew Bible as an Old Testament because it suggests that our covenant with God's an old covenant. And we like to think that we mess up from time to time, but that our covenant is still good. So instead, the Hebrew Bible itself is what we refer to as the written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, and then the section on prophets, and then the section that comes after prophets, which we call writings. It's Psalms and Proverbs and Book of Job and Book of Esther, Ruth, Song of Songs, that kind of thing. So that is kind of our basic sacred text. And then we have books and books and books on codes of Jewish law and on Jewish ethics and all sorts of things. And the story is very much an ongoing story. As we see, creation is not a one and done by God. Creation is an ongoing story in which we see ourselves as partners with God in the covenant.
I think we'd find that that's very similar for us as well. We too believe that we are a part of this ongoing story as we talk about every week. In what other ways would you say that we as Jews and Christians are similar? What sort of aspects of our faith do we share?
Well, let me explain it to you this way. First, I would tell you that I do a lot of work with Christian clergy. I do a lot of work in interfaith circles, particularly around issues of justice. I find we're partners on a lot of this work. And part and parcel of that is I'm part of an interfaith clergy Torah study group, or you call a Bible study group. So there's one other rabbi, and there are 4 Christian clergy. And we get together every week on Tuesday morning. And what we really have discovered is not that we're that much alike, but that we take very different approaches to theology, to our perspective on God. But what we know we do share is a sense of what our religion is ultimately about, which is to treat other people with dignity and compassion, to seek a better world. And really, when I say that God's a mystery, I think part of that compels us to use our imagination and not just imagine what God expects of us and to try and apprehend God's will so we do better in the world, but to get beyond the world that is, to imagine the world that can and should be. And I think that if there's anything that we share as not just Judaism and Christianity, but religions all across the spectrum, I think that may be the key piece, at least for me.
Yeah, I love that. Imagine the world as it could be, and what is our part in bringing about that world as what we can do today. Very cool. So we are talking a lot about stories. What are our defining stories? What is the story of God? What is our role in that? I'd love to hear, what are the defining stories and narratives of the Jewish people?
Certainly the Exodus from Egypt is a core story that defines us. And it defines us in a couple of ways. One, as it relates to God. So it's not everybody's first commandment. For some, it comes before the 10 Commandments. And actually, by the way, we don't say that we recognize the 10 Commandments, but actually we count 613 commandments in the Torah. Like I said, God keeps us busy. The first one for us is, I am the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt to be your God, which doesn't sound very commanding. But it really kind of sets the standards for the contract. So we know on our side of the contract we're supposed to perform the commandments, which includes, treating people with dignity and compassion. God's side of the covenant is to be a God of redemption, which gives us hope on an ongoing basis. And how do we, this is the behavior thing. How do we know? Because God has a track record. God redeemed us from slavery in Egypt. That's how we know God performs on God's side of the covenant. So that story sets off our relationship with God, but it also defines how we treat other people, because the most oft-repeated commandment in our Torah is some form of either don't oppress the stranger or love the stranger or love the stranger because God loves the stranger. And a piece of that verse is always love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, which is to say, if you recall what it felt like to be enslaved, you would never do that to somebody else. And so we're really obligated to remember our own Exodus story, to remember what's the right way to treat people and what's the wrong way to treat people. Beyond that, I would say standing at Mount Sinai, figuratively speaking, I had this discussion before we started this morning with someone who'd actually visited one of the places purported to be Mount Sinai. We actually don't know exactly where Mount Sinai is or was. But we all say, in some sense, that we stand at Mount Sinai and receive Torah. So that idea of God's revelation, God revealing aspects of God that form our relationship, that piece is a key piece. And I would say that the other piece is that everything else that's happened in the Jewish world, whether it be stories of persecution, the Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, or just even this morning, it all adds to the story. It is all an ongoing. And I would particularly say on this, the 1 year ago today, if you remember, was the tragic murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where 11 Jews were killed. So as I came over this morning, I was listening to a story on NPR about that, and my wife is from Pittsburgh. It's very personal to me. I emceed the vigil last year after the shootings, but it also makes me think of we're connected over senseless violence, and with Reed Underwood and William Corcoran from your congregation. So we are not alone in suffering tragedy, and we have, as Jews, we understand that we have to come together with people not like us, and that we are not the only victims in all this. So that's part of the story as well.
Yeah. Our theme for confirmation, as we're talking about stories, is the story of God, and how this is this ongoing grand narrative that we all get invited to be a part of. And that while the Bible is done being written, the story is not over. And we are continually being invited to further this story as we help to make the world a better place, as we are invited to love God and to love others, as we are invited to help ease the suffering and the oppression of others. Those are some of the things that we've been talking about, we're going to continue to talk about. And a couple weeks ago, the students were challenged, if you had to describe the story of God to a friend or to someone in your family in just one or two sentences, how would you say it? What would you say? And so I'm going to challenge you to do the same thing, Rabbi Doug. How would you describe the story of God in one or two sentences?
I don't know if I can come in on one or two sentences. It's a lot to ask for a rabbi. If nothing else, I think if you come through the story with the sense that my life has purpose and meaning, and cosmic purpose and meaning beyond what we can readily understand with our human intellect, whether or not that's delusional, look, if you go back and read prophets and they talk about how they communicate with God, if somebody came up to you today and said, I had this discussion with God, and they described it in the way the prophets described it, you would want to check them into a hospital. But even if I'm delusional, I really like my delusion. I think to live your life with the understanding that it does have purpose and meaning, and that you contribute to this world in that way, and you contribute to the story of God, I think that's an extraordinary way to live. Can I prove God? No, I can't. Has God chosen me from all the people in the world to reveal ultimate truth? I ain't the guy. But I don't know that I've ever met that person either. So I'm always wary of somebody who approaches God with a sense of absolute certainty versus with a sense of mystery and awe. And so that's, and finally, what I tell my folks in my congregation, where I most readily see God, is in the rearview mirror. The improbability of how I got to whatever place I am in my life, and that improbability is kind of, I see as God's hand in the story.
I like the sense of mystery and awe is important. We just studied the Trinity last week, so I think that's something we need to cling to. We often hear the phrase, that the Jews are God's chosen people, or that they were, they were specifically chosen to be a blessing, or they were blessed to be a blessing to others. I think we get confused a lot what that really means. Can you maybe break that down for us?
I think Jews get confused a lot about that one too. The tagline is sometimes it ain't so great to be chosen. They were chosen for what? If approached in a productive way, I think this notion of being chosen people carries with it a sense of obligation, and no more than that. The other expression is an Or L'Goyim, a light to the nations, and that if you live your life with the idea that it carries with it certain obligations, and the way you act in the world can be an example to others for doing good in the world or being really lousy in the world. So I think it's more a creation of an awareness about our obligations than anything else.
Okay. Well, last week you all submitted some really awesome questions for Rabbi Doug, and so we're going to switch to some of the questions that you guys submitted, and I couldn't get to all of them, so I kind of combined them and condensed them. So we're going to get to some. They're a little bit more personal. Some of them are a little bit more fun and lighthearted. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. So one is kind of more of a personal question, and is, what is your favorite aspect of the Jewish faith?
I think it's a sense of community. We say, we talked about the covenant, we say we're a communal covenant. We all stood together at Mount Sinai to receive Torah. And it's that sense of connectedness. So years ago, there were Ethiopians who claimed to be Jewish that were under threat. And the Jewish community raised $50 million in a week to get them to airlift them out of Ethiopia. And that's kind of indicative of the way Jews come together. And growing up in synagogue, it felt like home to me. I always felt like I belonged, and that sense of community is really that may be my favorite piece of the whole thing.
I think that's the same for me, being a part of the church too. When times of crisis happen, I don't know where I'd be without the church, without my church family. Okay, next question. I think a lot of us haven't had the chance to participate in a Jewish worship gathering. So tell us what that looks like. What are the sights we'd see? What are the sounds we'd hear? Smells, taste? What does a Jewish worship gathering feel like, look like, sound like?
Well, it depends on which synagogue you go to.
Probably depends on which church you'd go to, the same in the Christian faith.
But each synagogue will have an ark that'll contain the Torah, our Torah scroll, which is the 5 books of Moses. That Torah scroll
which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Right, which has different names in Hebrew, by the way, and they don't always translate to the same thing. So, for example, the book of Numbers in Hebrew is Bamidbar, which doesn't mean numbers, it means in the wilderness, which kind of describes the whole book's experience. But we have a Torah scroll. Most congregate, we don't have it because we don't own our building, but there's a little light called a Ner Tamid, the eternal light, and a bima or a pulpit. And depending on what denominational synagogue you run into, the service will look somewhat different, although the prayers are virtually the same. There's some difference, but not a ton of difference. So in a more liberal congregation, let's say in the Reformed Jewish world, I know this community has a strong relationship with Temple B'nai Yehuda, which is a Reformed congregation. So you'll hear more folk music, more contemporary music maybe as part of the worship experience. Whereas if you go to an Orthodox synagogue like BIAV over on Antioch, Beth Israel Abraham Wallner, it's an Orthodox synagogue. In that synagogue, they have a divider, so men and women pray separately. That's part of how Orthodox Jews pray. It's for our community, it's really problematic, particularly we have a lot of transgender members of our congregation. So to compel them to choose to be binary, to choose one side or the other is a real problem in our world. But in the Orthodox world, that still exists. It'll look, in a way, an Orthodox synagogue will look somewhat more disorganized and individualistic, but they all kind of know where they are. And they'll do kind of like, they'll stand and they'll do pray like this. You'll see a little bit more of this kind of movement. They seem to be more like kind of more fervently into it, where maybe in a Reformed congregation, everybody's sitting in their chairs, they're sitting up straight, they're kind of paying attention to what's going on. They don't seem to be so much on their own.
And everything's in Hebrew. Is there an English translation?
And certainly in an Orthodox congregation, everything's in Hebrew. In a conservative congregation like Beth Shalom, most everything is in Hebrew. As you get toward a Reformed congregation, you'll get more and more English. But every synagogue has at least some Hebrew in the service. And the singing, by and large, most of the prayers are sung in Hebrew.
What led you personally to becoming a rabbi? You said that you kind of had other career paths, and then you were ordained just a few years ago in 2012. So what kind of led you down that path?
I think I just like doing the things that rabbis do, and people said, "Yeah, you can walk into a room and you can, at the beginning of a meeting for like Jewish Federation, you could walk into a room and I could give you what is known as a Devar Torah, word of Torah, and it was pretty comfortable space for me." And people said, "Well, you do that really well," and I said, "Well, cool. This is what rabbis do. I think I would like to do that." I actually was accepted to a rabbinical program in the early 90s, and for family reasons that got put off indefinitely. So I have colleagues, clergy, who refer to it as being called. I don't feel like I was necessarily called, but I do feel, one, as I've gone through my rabbinical career, I feel increasingly honored in the work. Families welcome you into their lives and the most important aspect of their lives, and to walk with families on the journey. We've talked a lot about journey this morning. That's really important to me, and it's an honored position. It's an honored position to be a rabbi who gets to speak for justice. I got to speak at the Women's March. I've spoken at a number of stand-up KC rallies. I've been down to the border for immigrants twice, once to San Diego, Tijuana, and then El Paso, Juarez this past March. So to be able to be put in those kinds of spaces to do for others is really, it's what kind of turns me on about being a rabbi.
You get welcomed into kind of a different sort of space.
Yeah.
Yeah. So did you know that Jewish students actually go through confirmation as well? But it maybe looks a little bit different for Jewish students. So what does confirmation look like for Jewish students?
Well, so for students in 7th grade, usually 7th grade, some 8th grade, they go through bar or bat mitzvah. Bar mitzvah, son of the mitzvah is a commandment. Bar mitzvah, son of the commandments. Bat mitzvah is daughter of the commandments. So they go through a course of study. Usually, I mean, they've been in Hebrew school already, so they've been studying Hebrew and other aspects of Judaism and prayer and history. But they go into more intense preparation for their bar or bat mitzvah, where they will actually lead part of the service. They'll read out of the Torah. They'll chant what is known as the Haftorah, which is a section usually from prophets that will thematically relate to that week's Torah portion. We divide up the Torah into weekly portions over the course of a year.
Kind of like a lectionary.
Yeah, so through the course, but it's all in order. So in fact, this past week, we started over again. So we're back in Breshit, Genesis. We started the very first Torah portion. And the students will prepare what is known as the Devar Torah, word of Torah speech, kind of a mode of study of the Torah reading. There is such a thing as confirmation in the Jewish world. It was probably borrowed from Christianity in the 1800s. There was a time when, particularly in Europe and Germany and in France, what was known as the Enlightenment, which said, we're all equal, and Jews said, oh boy, finally, we get to be equal, this is cool. We'll act more like our non-Jewish brethren and be more kind of nationalistic. And part of that was kind of borrowing this idea of confirmation. It actually, if nothing else, it was kind of a tool to keep students in the game through high school, because that's when confirmation would take place in the Jewish community in high school. You don't see it in the Orthodox world. You see it less and less in other parts of the Jewish world. It's kind of waning. Bar and bat mitzvah are not going away, but confirmation, it happens. I just don't think it's quite as important as it once was.
How many of you have been to a friend's bar or bat mitzvah before? Okay, so quite a few of you. Awesome. That's really cool. Aren't you glad that at the end of confirmation, we don't make you get up in front of everyone in church and make you read a portion of scripture and say a word on it? No? Okay. We could incorporate that. We'll think on that. Okay, couple more questions here. What are the most important holidays or celebrations for those in the Jewish faith?
Probably the most important holiday is the one that happens every week. It's Shabbat. It's the Jewish Sabbath. Starts Friday night and it ends after sundown on Saturday night. It is this gift from God. It's part of the creation story. And it really is a time when you're not supposed to work, although some do, and there's a lot of prohibitions, things you're not supposed to do if you strictly keep Shabbat. And the idea being is that you take time out of your week away from work and away from just kind of wanting to control everything and just kind of being. And it's a glimpse of what a better world might look like. So we get a taste of that every week. So that really is the most important holiday. Beyond that, the ones that happen not every week, Passover is a favorite of mine. We talked about the Exodus from Egypt, but it's also the Passover Seder. I don't know if any of you have been to a Passover Seder. It is more than just about the Exodus in Egypt. It's really a time for deep Jewish discussion. It's made for that. It's made for argument. We love to argue with each other. It's how we learn. It's how we breathe, I think. And so that's always been a favorite holiday of mine. The holiday we just finished is known as Sukkot, Festival of Booths. And we put up our sukkah out in our community garden, and people will put them up outside their homes. And it's an opportunity to welcome in guests, welcome in the stranger. So we get right after Yom Kippur, where the Day of Atonement, where we've confessed our sins and promised God we're going to do better in the year to come. Sukkot immediately gives us an opportunity to do better, by welcoming people in and being open to who other people are and not just ourselves. So, I mean, we've got a lot of holidays. And so to go through all of them, it would be too much time. But those are some of the ones that I tend to like more, focus on.
Awesome. Any other thoughts that you have? We've got a couple more minutes in closing. Just anything you think that these 8th graders and high schoolers should know about Judaism, the Jewish faith?
Not that I could give you in a couple of minutes. It's, the other piece, and I guess if I swing back to what I like about Judaism, the other piece is the study piece, the ability to sit down with people and discuss and argue about the biggest life questions. And we learn, and I said it half jokingly, but we learn by challenging each other. That's the Jewish model of learning. We call it machloket l'shem shamayim, argument for the sake of heaven. So if we can all learn how to disagree with each other and still like and love each other, that's a pretty good day. And I think where we are right now is in a very different place where we don't tolerate any difference. We don't tolerate differences of opinion. We can't even agree on a set of facts. And it's kind of a troubling time. So if we can kind of just learn to be different and appreciate difference, with the acknowledgement that none of us have all the answers or even a lot of the answers. So I think that other piece of Judaism is a real important and favorite piece for me.
I think that's huge, and you mentioned it a few earlier. Part of why we wanted to do this here in Confirmation is our church and has really made a concerted effort in the last few years to help build better bridges with our Jewish brothers and sisters in the Kansas City area. Part of that was because of a tragic shooting that had occurred at the Jewish Community Center, where 2 members of our own congregation were actually killed. And part of that is just because we want to be better neighbors, not only with our Jewish brothers and sisters, but with everyone in our community, those who believe the same as us and those who believe slightly different than us and those who maybe believe very different than us. And then part of that is because we can learn from each other. Obviously, we believe we hold a lot in common with the Jewish faith. Jesus was a Jew. I don't know if you know that, but he was. And our roots are in the Jewish faith, and we can learn quite a bit from our brother Rabbi Doug here and from the Jews that we encounter in our lives, our neighbors, our friends. And so I hope that this starts a pattern of learning from one another, that we can humble ourselves and put ourselves in a position as constant learners from those we meet who maybe believe slightly different than us or very differently than us, that we have something to learn from everyone we encounter in our lives. So Rabbi Doug, I would love if you could actually close us in prayer, if you could pray for us and close us in a blessing.
Okay, so not all, but most of prayer for us are blessings. And usually like a really short blessing with a really long explanation. I won't do the long explanation. I'll kind of go through the blessing and kind of hit it as it comes. So in the Hebrew, it's Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu lirdof tzedek. So blessed is God, sovereign of the universe, who makes us holy with commandments, who puts us in partnership with God by commanding us, and commands us to lirdof tzedek, to pursue justice.
Beautiful.
Say
Let's
amen.
give Rabbi Doug a round of applause.